Okay, good evening, everybody. I thought we'd start on time, given that we're completely online today. However, I do have to say there are some people here in the room this evening, so there's quite a little group with us here, and I'm delighted to welcome Enrique and Gennaro, who've come over from the University of Warwick. It's always a pleasure to see them and their great colleagues and wonderful doctoral students there, and so it's really great to see them. I'm particularly delighted about tonight's lecture because it's on a topic very close to my own heart, and no better person than Professor Sam Slote from Trinity College in Dublin. Sam's research focuses on 20th century modernism and late modernism, with an emphasis on the work, particularly of James Joyce, but also Samuel Beckett. Methodologically, his work draws on a variety of theoretical approaches, such as deconstruction, genetic criticism, translation theory, mimetic theory, gender studies, and also textual studies. His most recent publications are Annotations to James Joyce's Ulysses, Oxford University Press, 2022. Ulysses is 40 years, a critical retrospective of Hans Walter Gabler's critical and synoptic edition of Ulysses that he did with Georgina Nugent in 2024. And other volumes include how Joyce wrote Finnegan's Wake in 2007, Rain Ascent, Joyce. I never get to pronounce that correctly. Help me out there, Sam. How would you pronounce it?
Renascent.
Joyce to 2013. Derrida and Joyce 2013 again, and Joyce's Nietzschean Ethics in 2013. So, and much else besides. He's also the founding director of the Samuel Beckett Summer School, and he's also published on authors as diverse as Vladimir Nabokov, Virginia Woolf, Marcel Proust, Borges, Stefan Mallarmé, Dante, one he's going to be talking about this evening, and also, and I read on his biography on his webpage, Elvis, but I don't think there's any Elvis this evening. His title for us tonight is Defututa Vulgari Eloquentia on Joyce's Eloquent Vulgarities. Sam, on you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'd like to very much thank Dara for inviting me to speak here. And I also have two apologies. One, that I can't make it to Cork today. A number of factors have conspired against that, including some home renovation, which I was just telling Dara as we're preparing that I think home renovation really deserves to be one of the punishments in the Inferno. The little bit of mess you can see behind me is only a small fraction of what I've been enduring, including problems with heating that's happening right now. Also, I'd like to apologize. This paper will be mostly about Joyce. There will be some Dante at the start, and I will be cycling back to Dante at the end. In effect, I'm going through a fairly detailed account of profanity in Joyce to raise a specific issue within reading the Commedia. And also, precisely because my topic is vulgar language, I suppose I should have the trigger warning that there will be some foul language in this paper by necessity, by virtue of what I'm talking about. In the Eumaeus episode of Ulysses, Bloom and Stephen overhear an unspecified number of Italians engaged in voluble expressions in their vivacious language, or more prosaically, arguing over money. I should get this set up properly. Puttana, Madonna, che dia i quattrini, ho ragione, culo rotto. Intendo mioci, mezzo sovrano più. Dice lui però, mezzo, farabotto, mortacci sui, ma ascolta, cinque la testa più. Bloom, utterly ignorant of what is being said, uses this occasion to praise the melodiousness of Italian and its bella poetria. It would actually be challenging to overhear such a kind of exchange and not pick up that it is an argument verging on vulgarity. The first speaker is the most obscene and uses strong and even violent expressions whose force is difficult to accurately convey in English. And this is a mistake we made in the annotations. With culo rotto, we translated it quite simply as, and literally as, broken asshole. Or blood, actually, as bloody asshole. The problem with that is that that expression really is not what's being said in Italian. In English, the term bloody asshole is just a more severe, more emphatic way of saying what a rotten jerk. But those words, culo and rotto, do not have those senses in Italian. So this is quite literally a bleeding, ruptured anus, an image of strong sexual violence. In any case, here, what the point I want to signal is that the English profanity actually censors or reduces the Italian obscenity. As the narrative voice indicates before the exchange is presented, there are some little differences between the parties, and these differences are also linguistic. At least one of the speakers is from Rome, since the expression mortacci sui is a typically Roman expletive, literally his filthy dead ancestors. None of the other expressions evince dialectal specificity, although the spelling of putana with two T's suggests that the speaker is from the center or south of the peninsula, since in northern dialects it would just be a single T. Which would also affect the pronunciation. But in any case, in the exchange as is presented in Eumaeus, there is only one dialect that is identifiable, and it's Roman. In terms of Romanescu, Dante, in his survey of Italian dialects, from whence I derive my title, is not entirely full of admiration for the Roman vernacular. What the Romans speak is not so much a vernacular as a vile jargon, the ugliest of all the languages spoken in Italy. And so, in his search for the eloquent vernacular, Dante quickly dismisses Roman. He has certain notions in mind in his hunt for the illustrious vernacular. It wanders like a homeless stranger, finding hospitality in more humble homes. That is, it, um, it is the common Italian, prevalent throughout the peninsula, but specific to no one region. It is both Heimlich and unheimlich, common and uncommon, and as such, that is how it can attain an eloquence unto itself. Dante's ambition in the De Vulgari Eloquentia is to prove that a vulgar language can attain the rarefied eloquence of Latin, and indeed he ultimately argues that a vulgar language can be more eloquent than Latin precisely because it is an everyday language and not a relic. Of course, Dante is talking about the vulgar language in the sense of a language that is, we would say, lingua vulgi, the language of the people. The impediment of Latin is that it is, as he calls it, grammatica, a rule-bound literary language. Latin is contrived and rule-bound, and this lends it an artificiality that occasions but also delimits its potential for eloquence. The illustrious vernacular thus shares Latin's eloquence without suffering from its artificiality, precisely because it is both universal and particular. The vulgar, in both senses, common language and obscene language, is the language of the people, the rabble. Both modes of vulgar language are victims of linguistic prescriptivism, which is often enmeshed and aligned with moral and socioeconomic vectors. School is one place where normative language is inculcated and more natural manners of expression may be suppressed. For example, in the intermediate examination that Joyce took in 1895, one of the questions involved identifying the grammatical faults in various sentences. And one of these supposedly faulty sentences was, I am after losing my pen, which is a perfectly correct Hiberno-English idiom, even if it would be considered too vulgar in British English. And so this examination literally penalizes the Irish for using Hiberno English. As Michael Adams traces out in his book In Praise of Profanity, in English, by the 17th century, the word vulgar began to acquire a moralizing sense, beyond just referring to the common everyday customs of the people. It more explicitly took on the sense of being uncultured or ill-bred or lacking in refinement. By the Victorian era, this increasingly moralizing overtone to the word began to apply to language. Vulgar speech was not just common speech, but obscene speech. This conflation of the two main senses of vulgar, the descriptive and the judgmental, occasions a fortuitous way of conceptualizing obscene language. Both modalities of the vulgar indicate the limits of what can be expressed in a normative, regulated language, grammatica, and not just in terms of prescriptivist strictures as can be evinced in Joyce's intermediate examination. Indeed, Latin itself is not immune to the vulgar, obscene discourse, as can be seen in the first line of Catullus's Carmina 41, Amaena puella Defututa. Obscene speech is common to everyday language, every local dialect, even the most raffiné. Like Dante's famous illustrious vernacular, vulgar obscene speech is both universal and particular. In part, Joyce's use of the vulgar tongue, in both senses, fits within what you could call his social realism. That is, his aim to accurately and precisely represent the Dublin milieu and patois. As he wrote Grant Richards, his publisher, during the extensive negotiations around publishing Dubliners, because his aim was to provide a, quote, nicely polished looking glass to his compatriots, quote, it is not my fault that the odor of ash pits and old weeds and offal hangs round my stories. Profanity is thus one more of the old weeds despoiling Dublin. In his further discussions with Richards, Joyce admits that he's willing to redact up to 3 instances of the word bloody in his collection, but he insists on keeping at least one in the story The Boarding House. And in order to appreciate the one he wants to keep, it's worth looking at least one of the instances he ultimately excises. And the one I've selected is in the story Ivy Day in the Committee Room and is in reference to Edward VII. Joyce originally wrote, here's the fellow come to the throne after his bloody old mother keeping him out of it till the man was grey. He revised it to, here's the chap come to the throne after his old mother keeping him out of it till the man was grey. And so besides eliminating the bloody, Joyce also tones down the use of the local dialect. In a later revision, he also deletes the Hiberno-English owl and replaces it with the more conventional old. And so his editing eliminates both modes of vulgar language, the local and the obscene, neither of which he felt was apparently necessary in this particular instance. But the line that Joyce insisted on keeping is in the story The Boarding House. If any fellow tried that sort of game on with his sister, he'd bloody well put his teeth down his throat. In part, this line is something of the quality of an oath, which is signaled by the profanity. Jack swears in both senses of the word. The swearing intensifies the swear. Apropos this line, Joyce protested to Richards, the word, the exact expression I have used, is in my opinion the one expression in the English language which would create on the reader the effect which I wish to create. Indeed, beyond simply being a vulgar intensifier, in context, the word also connotes a sense of a literally bloodied and battered mouth. Joyce's insistence on keeping the word shows this particular bloody cannot be paraphrased. This seems counterintuitive since one of the cliches that circulates around the use of profanity is that one should always be able to say something else, that profanity should always be paraphrasable by some artful, euphemistic dodge. But there is also something singular about profanity, something that resists simple paraphrase. Euphemism divests profanity of its specific performative frisson, or rather, it replaces its performative frisson with a different performative aspect, such as modesty, whether sincere or feigned. It would not quite be the same if Joyce had changed Jack's line to, he'd jolly well put his teeth down his throat. And so I think this shows that profanity is like a good poem, as per Cleanth Brooks's famous analysis in The Well-Wrought Urn, in that profanity loses something essential in paraphrase. And Roman Jakobson's categorization of the communicative functions of language can help signal what and where such a loss might be. Jakobson divides communication into 6 functions: referential, emotive, conative, metalingual, phatic, and poetic. And profanity plays across all 6 of these to varying degrees. The referential aspect of profanity, its semantic meaning, is non-trivial, but is also insufficient to explain its force. As Adams puts it, when you exclaim fuck, there's no fucking in it. If you prefer shit, there isn't a whiff of excrement in the air. The pragmatic meanings have overtaken the lexical meanings of the words. This is all very obvious, but the pragmatic meanings are not irrelevant either, as I'll get to in a moment. And so profanity derives its force what could be called its gestural aspects. In Jakobson's typology, this gestural dimension could be classed as a range of affects from the mood of the speaker, emotive, to the mood elicited in the audience, conative. And in terms of this emotive function, as the character Captain Haddock from the Tintin stories ably shows, any word can be a curse word if said with enough force and vigor. And an example of such an unexpected curse word from Captain Haddock and many people's favorite is anakoluth, anakoluthon. And so beyond the speaker's mood, the audience's mood, the conative function is far from insignificant. For example, in his exchange with Richards, Joyce stressed the importance of that bloody, since it was the only word that could create on the reader the effect that I wish it to create. According to Jakobson's typology, the metalingual aspect refers to the specificity of local dialect. Different vernaculars have their own proper local vulgarities. One man's putain is another man's cazzo. For example, the expression mortacci sui from Eumaeus indicates that its speaker is specifically from Rome or its immediate environs. But beyond that, the curse against ancestors would derive its force from specifically Italian cultural attitudes towards family. In a different culture with different familial relationships, a curse against one's ancestors would perhaps be less impactful. Likewise, the offensiveness of Puttana Madonna derives from its source in a very Catholic country. The metalingual aspect is perhaps the most significant factor in terms of the obscenity of vulgar language, but it also shows how the pragmatic, the immediate semantic meaning of the word is not irrelevant, but is enmeshed within the larger metalingual context. Likewise, vulgarities enjoy a phatic function in that they are often communication for the sake of communication. One does not need to curse when one hits one's thumb with a hammer. And then there's the subject of this essay, the poetic use of vulgarity, where Jakobson calls the palpability of language, where the palpability of language dominates. To at least some extent, this would involve the exuberance or even the jouissance of swearing. Simon's expression, shite and onions, is a perfect example of a joyful swear with its playful reworking of the expression tripe and onions. Vulgarity thus plays across all the resources of language. Robert Graves concludes Lars Porsenica, his study on the future of swearing, with a brief consideration of Ulysses, where he claims that only the character Simon is able to harmonize religion, politics, and obscenity into something like an artistic reality. Indeed, Simon is the Captain Haddock of Ulysses. And although Graves is perhaps a little bit narrow in his assessment, since Ulysses does abound with artful vulgarity, Graves elsewhere echoes Judge Wolsey's famous judgment that Ulysses is not pornographic, but rather is a deadly serious work in which obscenity is anatomized as it has never been anatomized before. Joyce has brought himself as far beyond obscenity as Shakespeare got beyond the lust of which he makes frank confession. For Graves, it is not a question of there being eloquence in Joyce's obscenities, but rather obscenity is but one of the multiple aspects to Joyce's revolution of language. And Joyce's revolution of language begins, like Dante's, with the fractures of the vernacular. He takes advantage of the fact that there are many different dialects of English, and indeed many different dialects of English just within Ireland. As Terence Dolan writes, Joyce has dismantled English and deconstructed it as a Tower of Babel with many component parts, led by English and Irish in the form of Irish English. Joyce exuberates in the idiosyncrasies of Hiberno English. An example Dolan gives is the word dunduckety mud colored. And dunduckety is an unusual Hiberno English word, primarily associated with the North, and it's a derisive term for a dull brown color, and so it's somewhat synonymous with mud colored. But even if the specific sense is unknown to the reader, its contemptuousness would be easily inferable. And so the literal sense may remain obscure, but the overall sense of the word is immediately evident. And so the eloquence of vulgar language would derive from an interplay of the various communicative dimensions that Jakobson identifies, in particular the metalingual and poetic aspects. And Joyce's sensitivity to the nuances of both modalities of the vulgar tongue are nothing short of formidable. For example, Brian O'Nolan commended Joyce for the old woman's line in Cyclops, mister, your fly is open, mister. In particular, he noted that that second mister is a quintessentially a piece of Dublinese. The repetition here is precisely what makes the line so singular, but also so particular. Likewise, Crawford's Kiss My Arse and Kiss My Royal Irish Arts are perfectly little bits of profane vernacular. Cyclops is especially replete with what is called the native Doric. The citizen provides many examples of demotic vulgarity, especially when he indulges himself in his favorite pastime of excoriating the perfidy of the English. To hell with the bloody, brutal Sassenachs and their patois. And so the citizen here echoes Hyde's admonition to de-anglicize Ireland and the Irish, albeit in a more vituperative and colorful vein. In his attack of the English patois, as he styles it, he uses the Hiberno-English word Sassenach, which Mulligan had earlier used to characterize Haynes. Technically, the word derives from the Irish word for Saxon, Sassenach, and it's used to refer to any English person or Protestant. But within a specifically Irish or Hiberno-English milieu, that is one informed by a contentious history with England, this word takes on a specific vituperative force. That is, its metalingual aspect is most important. Turning again to Brian O'Nolan, in one of his Crushkeen Lawn columns for the Irish Times, he makes this point about the singularity of this word in the context of the ambiguities of the Irish vocabulary. He writes, there is scarcely a single word in the Irish, barring perhaps Sassenach, that is simple and explicit. Uh, oh, I got my cat did something. Are we all cool? Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay, yeah. My cat did something. Okay, so but anyway, Brian O'Nolan says that there's only one single word in Irish that's single, simple, and explicit, and that word is Sassenach, which I think is very good as a way of defining the vituperative nature of that word within the Irish context. It becomes a curse to the specificity of the local patois. And the citizen continues his disapprobation in an increasingly colorful rant. Um, their civilization, you mean, says the citizen. To hell with them. The curse of a good-for-nothing god light sideways on the bloody thick-lugged sons of whores gets. No music and no art and no literature worthy of the name. Any civilization they have, they stole from us, tongue-tied sons of bastard goats. And so the citizen's cursing here um, um, be, um, involves casting a curse on the English. And this curse builds on repetition and variation, both in terms of semantics and vocalization. Sons of whores gets, sons of bastard goats. The curse is built on a rhythmical, alliterative agglutination of invective. In its profane eloquence, this condemnation is most certainly not the product of someone who is tongue-tied. And so this is an eloquent use of the native Doric to curse and excoriate. An oxen of the sun circulates across many distinct idiolects, specifically many different literary idiolects, that is, until the final section. But rather than look at these various exercises in refined styles, I would like to look at Lynch's brief chanty that comes in response to Mulligan's cock and bull story about the dominion over Ireland enjoyed by the British throne and the Catholic Church. Pope Peter's but a piss-a-bed, a man's a man for a that. This is only one of three pieces of direct dialogue in this episode, all signaled via tirette. The second line here derives from Rabbie Burns's song, Song for a That and a That. The rank is but the guinea stamp, the man's the gowd for a that, who though in hamely fare we dine, wear a hodden grey and a that, gear fools their silks and knaves their wine, a man's a man for a that. Burns is, of course, famous for dignifying the Scottish dialect. And so one element of Lynch's chanty is to employ an overtly non-standard dialect. Now, the word piss-a-bed from the first line, used to deride the Pope and the Catholic Church as such, comes from the children's rhyme Piss-a-bed, which was recorded in Tommy Thumb's Pretty Songbook from 1744, which is the earliest extant collection of nursery rhymes, although this particular one was frequently omitted from later such collections because it's, kind of dirty. Piss a bed, barley butt, your bum's so heavy you can't get up. Gillian Avery writes of this rhyme that its tone of crude and simple abuse suggests that it is authentically a rhyme that had been composed by children, as opposed to the more genteel children's rhymes, which tend to be written for children by adults. And so Lynch's little poem thus combines two vulgarities, profane and vernacular language. In Oxon, Scottish dialect is most typically associated with Crothers, the Scottish medical student. This is most evident in the final section, The Buster, which sees the men decamp to Burke's pub, and the section is rendered in a brazenly demotic style. Individually, speakers are frequently, but not always, identifiable on basis of context or their individuating patois, such as Crothers' stereotypically Scottish phrasing of "hoots, mon, a wee drap to pree." Now, the Buster section is the most vulgar portion of Ulysses in that it consists of a wide range of different patois and idiolects, all strung together with effectively no contextualization. While vulgar, though, there is little eloquence in the sequence, despite, or perhaps because of a few attempts at pretension from Mulligan and Stephen, who at various points quotes some Latin phrases. Overt profanity is actually absent from this sequence, and instead there are various euphemistic dodges. Blurry, holy flyer, bluggy, and Lynch's idiosyncratic profanity yellow in excrement yellow gospeler, which is perhaps the only vulgarity in this sequence that approaches eloquence. The most amusing part of this phrase, beyond the jaundiced bloody, is that the word excrement, a perfectly normal, even almost neutral or clinical term, takes on the force of being a swear word precisely because it is used as a euphemism. Perhaps the most significant instances of profanity in Ulysses are the citizens' invective against Bloom and Private Carr's invective against Stephen. They each deploy profanity whilst condemning their opponent for besmirching the name of, respectively, Christ and the King. Thus, the soi-disant defenders of church and state are linguistically hypocritical. The citizens' invective comes as a single short, sharp burst. By Jesus, says he, I'll brain the bloody Jew man for using the holy name. By Jesus, I'll crucify him, so I will. As with Jack's line in the boarding house, the citizen's exclamation involves both dimensions of swearing, a profanity-laden oath. The profanity actually weakens the oath, making it seem more performative. Indeed, profanity is actually euphemistic in that it is performative rather than literal. Unlike the citizen's single curse, the soldier's curse is repeated 3 times. Tugging at his belt, "I'll wring the neck of any fucker says a word against my fucking king." Loosening his belt, shouts, "I'll wring the neck of any fucking bastard says a word against my bleeding fucking king." With ferocious articulation, "I'll do him in, so help me fucking Christ. I'll wring the bastard fucker's bleeding blasted fucking windpipe." This profanity augments with each new invective, thereby signaling Carr's increasing agitation and inclination towards violence. Across the first 2 invectives, we have an increase in profanity and repetition, and by the third invective, Carr has even forgotten to mention both the king and Stephen's apparent misdeed, and is signaling only the action. The use of profanity in these passages is akin to what's called ornamentation in music, the accumulation of grace notes to embellish a melody. The profanity here adds rhythm, force, and purpose to Carr's impending violence. Outside his writings, Joyce rarely used profanity. Frank Budgeon recalls, "A great collector of his neighbor's oaths, see the Citizen in the Cyclops episode in Private Carr and Circe, Joyce himself never or rarely swore by 1 God or 9. His favorite exclamation when annoyed was a crisply uttered, but in context harmless Italian, 'Ma che.'" Joyce's use of profanity in Ulysses comes from his general sensitivity to patois, to the way other people speak, and does not seem to derive from first-hand experience of the exuberance of swearing. Unlike his father, Joyce lacks the elan of a natural-born swearer. Indeed, he uses vulgarity because it is vulgar language. That is, because it is the language people use. His swearing is not like the illustrious vulgarities of lines like the maximalist "for fuck's fucking fuck's sake, fuck it" from Stephen Frear's 1987 film Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, or the wonderfully minimalist "fuckity bye" from Armando Iannucci's 2009 film In the Loop. The Ithaca episode is not known for vulgarity. It certainly lacks a repertoire of the vernacular. R.W. Dent's book, Colloquial Language in Ulysses, devotes less than 2 pages to cataloging Ithaca, and almost all its entries are proverbial rather than dialectal expressions. Indeed, in his headnote for the episode, Dent notes that the very presence of even these few expressions came as a surprise to him. Rather than vulgarity, Ithaca is something of a euphemistic episode, emphasizing the indirectness of free indirect discourse. For example, right at the start, instead of a duo, we have a dumvirate, and so on. And one of the most obtuse passages in this episode poses some interesting questions concerning the expression and expressiveness of vulgarity. The natural grammatical transition by inversion involving no alteration of sense of an aorist preterite proposition parsed as masculine subject, monosyllabic, onomatopoeic transitive verb with direct feminine object from the active voice into its correlative aorist preterite proposition parsed as feminine subject, auxiliary verb, and quasi-monosyllabic onomatopoeic past participle with complementary masculine agents in the passive voice. Wading through this grammatical terminology, we can actually derive the 2 propositions proposed here. He fucked her, masculine subject and direct feminine object, and she was fucked by him, feminine subject and complementary masculine agent. The recondite elaboration aorist preterite denotes that this was a simple action that has occurred and was completed in the past. Quasi-monosyllabic suggests that the second fucked is pronounced as having 2 syllables, fuck it, perhaps an imitation of Molly's pronunciation. That would be her vulgar language, not vulgar in the sense of obscenity, but vulgar, not just in terms of obscenity, but vulgar in terms of her own particular patois. 2 blunt, crude statements indicating the same event, but from complementary perspectives, are, um, are rendered in a cold, coded manner. In effect, Joyce is using the technical terminology of grammar to indicate obscenity. The rules of convention are deployed to coyly present that which flouts decorum. Indeed, here, the two masked obscenities would be used in their literal sense. Had these statements been presented in the text directly, he fucked her, she was fucked by him, that would certainly elicit an effect of the rawness of Bloom's nerves and emotions concerning the certainty of what had happened during his absence that day. But the euphemistic, the extremely euphemistic encoding adds more to this passage than simply a dollop of difficulty for difficulty's sake. Normally, euphemistic dodges for profanity, Jeepers Creepers or Janie Mac, are not exactly cunning masks. Michael Adams, in his study of profanity, likens such euphemisms to a see-through fig leaf. On the other hand, in this case, the circumlocution is all too effective, and the profanity remains hidden to all but the most dedicated readers or annotators. The superficial effect is to conceal the rawness of the emotion, but in so doing, in this particular way, the rawness is translated into a distinct register of, for example, psychological avoidance. By being non-communicative, it actually expresses quite a lot. And so this act of overtly intellectualized subterfuge betrays an even deeper emotion. It's pedantry as evasion. Rather than express, so the cumbersome paraphrase expresses a complex series of uneasy, ambivalent reactions to Molly's infidelity and to Bloom's impotence. In repressing profanity, it expresses Bloom's emotions rather than his language as such. And here I'm going to start the pivot back to Dante, because this is not a million miles away from a negative theology. Rather than express or censor the lingua vulgi, here we have grammatica expressing something typically consigned to a vulgar language. The statement reveals and conceals in equal measure. It's both Heimlich and unheimlich. It's raw and crass and crude and colloquial, and it's something weird and just barely comprehensible. Like the best expletive, like the best of expletives, this Ithacan periphrasis cannot be adequately paraphrased, since any paraphrase would unbalance the various communicative aspects. So, vulgar language expresses what regular demure language cannot express, that which is other to language. And this leads to the other dimension of vulgarity in the Commedia, its apophatic quality, a language that denies or de-negates language. Of course, no moment in the Commedia is more important for this than when the pilgrim finally beholds God. Così la neve al sole si disiglia, così al vento nelle foglie levi si perdea la sentenza di Sibiglia. As with the persiflage over Bloom's stark understanding or revelation of Molly's infidelity, the divine revelation is supplemented, covered over by a complex imbrication of figural language. The experience is not just a trace, that track in the snow, since the snow itself has melted, making for a double erasure. The experience of beholding God is inconceivable and exceeds powers of intellect and language, and so we are left with a euphemism. But unlike the transparent fig leaf, which Michael Adams calls euphemistic dodges for profanity, the leaf here, the fallen Sibylline leaves, are all too formidable a mask. In effect, with this final proxy of an image, Dante has rendered the divine as if an unsayable and unsaid profanity sequestered from the discourses of his vernacular language, the non si poria of transhumaning language with words. And so to conclude, in a letter from 1984 to his friends Avigdor and Atik Arika, Beckett wrote of his latest work, Stirrings Still. Ineffable departure. Nothing left but to try and F it. Um, in a variety of idiosyncratic ways and means, vulgar language F's the ineffable. And this is what both Joyce and Dante's vulgarities convey. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to unmute myself. Thank you, Sam. That was brilliant. I'm really am delighted that we've been able to do this because for years I've wanted someone to talk about Dante and Joyce and no better man than yourself. Do you mind taking off your stop sharing your screen?
Oh yeah. Sorry about that.
And now I'm sure there are going to be plenty of questions. I love though that statement that you made earlier on in the lecture, where you said that Joyce lacks the elan of a natural swearer, and it's something that I've never really considered before. But by the same token, you have to say, and this is something I think he shares with Dante, that Joyce, his embrace of language and the possibilities of language, and without moving us off into Finnegan's Wake, but even staying within Ulysses itself, this sheer joy and the possibilities of what language can do, including the swearing and the wonderful prefaces that you mentioned there about, from Mystica. This is something I think that distinguish the two of them as these kind of global writers that have had such an impact. It is literally because of this sheer joy in what language and languages contained within them can do. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that point was a little bit of an exaggeration because there are certainly some well deployed bits of profanities I tried to indicate, but I think comes from Joyce's his ear rather than his natural inclination. And it's why the sort of Flann O'Brien, who has a very famously contested relationship with Joyce, he did admire and appreciate Joyce's ear. And in effect, with that line, he's saying that I have a good enough ear to recognize that Second Mister is a piece of Dublinese, but I don't have a good enough ear to write that directly myself. And I think one way of construing Joyce's evolution as an artist from chamber music to Finnegan's Wake, because he didn't write many works, they're all quite different from each other, is that Joyce recognizes his ability, his very, very good ear at both imitating specific literary styles, but also representing specific characters. And with each work, he's taking that one step further. And indeed, within Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, taking it a step further within that work itself. And I think that's one way of trying to characterize Joyce's entire oeuvre. If you remember, in 2004, Roddy Doyle got a lot of press for saying that, Joyce could have used a good editor. And I think it's very interesting that Doyle made that comment, because Doyle also has a very good ear for specifically reproducing local a character's dialogue. Like Joyce, you can have pages of dialogue without an X said, Y said, Z said, that he counts on himself to give each character a distinct way of speaking, and likewise he counts on his reader to be able to figure that out. But because Joyce has that, he takes it steps further with having all manner of, to use the technical term, weird shit. And the Cyclops episode is, I think, a very good illustration of that, because you have the Roddy Doyle-esque pub narrative, but you also have those weird burlesque intrusions, which I think would be an example of what Doyle would say, like maybe he should have someone editor saying, "Hey, Jim, tone this down a wee bit."
Which I think are probably the best parts of that episode. And just on a kind of a broader scale, because you've been working on Joyce for years, and you have considered these things. And I really liked today in your lecture with us as you're kind of going at it at a micro level, using vulgarity, profanity as a backdrop to look at it. But so when we think of Ulysses, and I want to stick with Ulysses this evening, if we can, but if we think of Ulysses, when we think of the kind of Homeric structure that underpins it, we think of Shakespeare as this great figure that Joyce has in mind as a kind of predecessor or precursor. And this is not an easy it's not an easy question to answer in a context like this, but where would you place Dante? Because I've often been convinced that Joyce and Beckett, because the two of them were undergraduate students who studied Italian, who studied their Dante in the original language, had a very different relationship to Dante than did other high priests of modernism. That theirs was much more of a visceral thing. And that their rapport, and I think in both Beckett and in Joyce, they're very, very different relationships to Dante. But in a couple of sentences, where do you see Dante in relation to Joyce?
Well, it is very different from Beckett's, where Beckett does take Dante both as a poetic and as an intellectual current. Joyce is a slightly different direction that so go about this with. And it's sort of one of the big differences between the Joyce of 1904 and Stephen Dedalus is in terms of Shakespeare. That in 1904, the Joyce, very pretentious, said, Shakespeare's overrated. There are dramatic blunders in Macbeth. And then over the years, his attitude changed considerably until what we see in Ulysses with Stephen's great theory in Scylla and Charybdis. But back when Joyce was dismissing Shakespeare, he said that Ibsen, not Shakespeare, is the heir to the Dantean mantle of European poetry. And so that Dante defines European poetry. And I think that sense remains constant for Joyce. And indeed, Joyce drafted Beckett to write the famous essay Dante, Bruno, Vico, Joyce, where primarily because Beckett knew Dante quite a lot, had heard of Vico, knew nothing about Bruno. So it was a little bit of a crib, but it's the connection with Dante was, I think, the most important, especially with Finnegan's Wake and Beckett's lines that Waking language is purgatorial. That it's sort of plugging in to inventing language, but inventing language not ex nihilo, inventing language from what is around. That it's in the term mimesis, this is one of the sort of, I think, the big misunderstandings of it in terms of Aristotle's definition. It's not imitatio, it's not copying. Right in the Poetics, there is a creative dimension to mimesis, that it is the stylized, it is a stylized copy. And Dante's creation of the eloquent vernacular is that the Italian dialects all pre-exist Dante, but they are cobbled into something new, even perhaps singular, in the Commedia. Likewise, Joyce isn't just creating a Hiberno-English literary language, he's redefining the English literary language. So it's not just a kind of post-colonial revenge. And indeed, he's perhaps redefining a European language, as you have the line in Finnegan's Wake, like Engels opened out to Europeans. That English is itself already a very hybridized multiple tongue, neither Romance nor Germanic. And so Joyce is returning it to the Babel from whence it came to create something new. And I think that's very much a Dantean mode. So it's perhaps the very definition of what literary output is, that possibility was signaled for Joyce by Dante.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. Now, I'm going to open it up to questions in the audience here in the room and also online. Please don't be shy.
Cat I'll let the cat out.
Okay, bye, Spiky. First time we've had a cat as a kind of an interlocutor at one of these lectures, so thank you for that. So, Chiara Valcelli has a question for us.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for this. And I have a kind of question, curiosity, because when you were talking about the concept of the palpability of language, no? Since I'm very interested on the language of the body and so the incarnation, the embodiment in both Joyce and Dante, no? I was also thinking about Joyce that defined Ulysses as the epic of human body. And also Dante has a strong corporeality in the Commedia. And so I was thinking, what do you think about maybe the relationship between this kind of vulgare, and so the vulgar language, the obscenity and vulgarity, and the body? I mean, Joyce is using a lot of, the words that are maybe obscene or vulgar words to describe also Bloom's activity or I don't know, something that is about the body. And so, I would like maybe to ask you, what is the relationship between the obscenity and vulgarity and the body in Ulysses?
I mean, it would be different in different episodes. I mean, notionally, individual episodes in Ulysses are pegged, or at least not all of them are pegged to an organ through the schema, but those are maybe more decorative rather than fundamental. It's like if there's a reference to the skeleton, then that's just, if they happen to have a phrase about the skeleton in an episode, it's not necessarily something substantial that's built in to the episode. There would be key exceptions, though. I think Penelope would be the episode to look at the most because, on the one hand, it's the most embodied episode, but it's also the most linguistic episode. That Molly isn't the word made flesh, but the flesh made words. So it's body as affect of language, but there's a deep mnemonic history of embodied experience that's indicated throughout that episode. There are likewise smaller snatches of that throughout Ulysses, particularly when it comes to sense. And I think the sensory apparatus would be the places to look at. Like on the one hand, overtly you have Stephen overtly thinking about the phenomenology of vision, with ineluctable modality of vision, and then Bloom in Nausicaa just has the same basic sentiment but much better expressed. Colors depend on the light you see. I mean, that's what Stephen's trying to think of, without that sort of mask of heavy Aristotelian pretension. So I think embodied experience comes from perception and from sense. One of the things that you don't, and I'm struggling to think, I don't think you get much of in Ulysses, is physical pain. There's not much in terms of pain as a sensation. So it's all about, the senses are primarily restricted to the five big ones, not all the newer adjuncts that have been postulated.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for this. Thank you.
Although I guess, sorry, but thirst and hunger, not quite pain, but those would be the maybe exceptions to that. Because those are at least a sense of physical discomfort.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? While I'm waiting there, I'm when you're talking about sense and vision, you reminded me of the Proteus episode of the very final passages of that, when Stephen is on the beach and he looked over his shoulder. I don't have Ulysses in front of me, so I'm quoting from memory. He turned his shoulder, rear regardant,
Yes.
And this act at the very end of a chapter which basically quotes from Dante in the original, Il Maestro di color che sanno, obviously in reference to Aristotle, but it is actually Joyce also quoting from the very first simile of the Commedia.
Yes.
That he who turns behind him to look at the shipwreck and that he's escaping, si volge eretto rimarrà lo passo che non lasciò già mai persona viva. And this kind of rimarar is a rear regardant. And this again, Joyce is patterning elements of the Commedia at an intertextual level throughout the work, and it really is a fascinating thing.
It's also Dante plays a very significant role in Stephen's evolution, where in ALS, Stephen makes the horrible mistake of comparing his poetry to Dante's, which if you do, you're going to lose, and especially if you're not writing it in Italian. But I know when he said the Paolo and Francesca bit, where it's just to emphasize the eloquence of the Terza Rima. But I, old man, leaden pennant footed, south mouth. And it's at that moment Stephen decides he's not going to become a poet. He switches to prose narrative because he ends the episode with the parable of the plums, which begins with, in his mind, Dubliners. And so it's as if that's one more stories for Dubliners with its Dublin setting and a theme of paralysis. So it's thinking of Dante, he abandons being a poet and switches to prose narrative. And because the parable of the plums is the only time we see, really the only time we see Stephen engage in something like Joyce's aesthetics. So Dante is a good role, or at least negative role model for him.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Okay, now I realize that it is getting on. Or do we have any other questions in the room, or will we let Sam off the hook? And I think Spikey is also looking hungry.
Yes, spikers.
Now, before we go, I just want to remind everybody that our final lecture in the series is taking place over in the council room next Monday, and we're going to be welcoming back Dr. Leila Livraghi. Leila, some of you will remember, did an IRC postdoc with us a number of years ago. And she's going to be talking, and this is one really for the classicists amongst us, giving a lecture titled Per te poeta fui, per te cristiano, for you I was a poet, for you I am a Christian, Dante's status and the authority of Virgil. So I think this is particularly, we've gone to Joyce and now we go back to the classical tradition. So you're all very welcome to come along at 6 o'clock to the council room. For those of you outside of the Cork area, you can always follow us online. But would you please join me in thanking Sam for a quite wonderful lecture? It was really brilliant, and it was a pity you couldn't come down. The money I was going to take you pints and pizzas, I'm going to splash it on other people. No, I don't have any money at all. But Sam, we'll get you down eventually at some point, but I really do appreciate it. And so thank you very, very much. And that was an excellent lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, apologies for not being able to make it down to Cork. I have cats and a broken house to deal with.
Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you all next week.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.